we're doing this social experiment with no thought for the consequences of it.
I'm Jane,
Hello, I'm Julia Long.
And I'm Bex,
and this is
Insightful Sisters.
Oh, hello, Julia. It's so nice to have you tonight. This is the second time I've interviewed you. Well, interview in conversation with, it was a bit chaotic, wasn't it?
Well, very, very enjoyably so, from what I remember. Yeah, so I think it was maybe it started as an interview, but it didn't really stick to that format,
didn't.
which I'm really pleased about because I think it's much nicer just to have a chat.
Yeah.
I had such a wonderful time
Yeah.
with
So for
you.
anyone who doesn't know, Julia came to Virago in Leeds. We've got a women's only space in Leeds, and Julia kindly came and talked to us, and it was just so much fun. For anyone who doesn't know, it's a women only space, and it's like one of those old-fashioned spaces that you got in the 70s or 80s. It's really sort of welcoming. We have about 25 to 30 people there at our meetings, and we have a speaker and we have in conversations with, and also they do art classes and creative writing classes. So it's a proper old-fashioned women-only space, and there's a bit of magic, isn't there, that happens in those sorts of spaces.
Oh, it's really lovely. I mean, one of the things I was so taken with was just how beautiful it was that the building and all the artwork and yeah, I just thought I could really tell how much love and care had gone
Yeah,
into it. It was so I was really glad that because I don't know if you remember I got there a bit early and
yeah.
had a look at some of the artwork and met some of the artists, like the women who produced it, and yeah, it was really lovely. So when you say it's like one of those old-fashioned women-only spaces, I do agree, but I think it's a bit nicer than some of the ones that I remember in terms of just being very, very
Yeah.
comfortable and really, yeah, really sort of very warm and welcoming. And just looking around, like some of the women I knew, some of the women I hadn't met before, but there's just such a wealth of knowledge and experience in that room.
Yeah.
I had such a great
It
time. I
was well,
just
it was
yeah,
lovely, and
really enjoyed it.
so of all the things that you've done, so you've been a feminist for forever. You're a researcher, an academic. You've worked in women's services, women's refuges, women's on the Femicide Project. And you've written a
Uh,
book about pornography, and you saw some of the things that were happening in the women's movement. You spotted them a long, long time before other people, didn't you?
I think well, before some people and certainly not before others, I think you see what kind of comes into your view depending
Yeah,
on where you
yeah,
are at any particular point, don't you? I
yeah.
think. And so I think my my position and why I became alert to what a problem, if we want to call it transgenderism, whatever we want to call it, this whole kind of movement to falsify sex. I think I saw it, relatively, good few years ago now, like because of where I was and because of the opportunities that I had and the kind of life that I was living. So, I went to university in the 80s. I was really fortunate to be taught by some absolutely brilliant feminist lecturers, one in particular who's a radical feminist. And I think that really, I really became very politicized back then in the sort of like mid to late 80s. And although I have done quite a lot of different things, since then, like I was teaching for a while, I was doing different things, but that has become, that has been quite a constant. And because I'm lesbian, because I've always, recognized the importance of, lesbians needing our own space and the importance of women only space. I suppose those of us who were in those environments became aware of men wanting to intrude on those spaces, maybe before some of the women who weren't in those spaces, who it wouldn't necessarily have crossed your path. There can be different scenarios where you're going to come across it before others, but certainly I've become aware of these men pretending to be women and pretending to be lesbians I suppose from around the late 90s, but I must admit, even initially, and I think probably a lot of us have been on this path of just at that point, just seeing it as such a minority thing. I didn't
Yeah.
understand it to be a really serious threat. I
Mm.
just thought it's such a minority thing, and if lesbians don't want these men in our groups, and if women don't want these men in our spaces, we can just say no.
Mm.
And I was sort of naive to think that they'd respect that, or that that would be sufficient. But a lot of other, lesbians, lesbian feminists were far more aware of it than I was at the time. So obviously Janice Raymond wrote her book, The Transsexual Empire, that was published in 1979. The time that I remember as being really fundamental to my understanding how serious it was when I heard Sheila Jeffries speak in, I think it was about 2005, 2006. That sort of time I heard her speak at a conference, and she wasn't even talking about transgenderism, but she did mention it at a time, and she mentioned the GRA, and she discussed the Hansard transcripts of the debates at the time. And I'd actually been living in Ireland at that time, and I was maybe vaguely aware of it again. I really didn't have my eye on the ball. And when I heard her speak about that, that it really became very clear. I think Sheila's just got this wonderful gift of making things very, very clear, not in any way kind of soft soaping it, like just, very clear and very urgent.
Mm.
I remember her message being, and that I just felt like the scales fell from my eyes then.
Mm.
And so I suppose by the time I then I moved back to London sort of late 2006, early 2007. I got involved with London Feminist Network, and that's because we were involved in everything we were doing was women only organising. And that was when I really started to experience the impact of men wanting to come on Reclaim the Night, wanting to come to our meetings. And but it was a bit later on, 2012, when I co-organised a very explicitly women only conference. And that was when, by then, they'd started to get so emboldened that when we set up this very explicitly women only conference, it was absolutely besieged. We were absolutely under attack, and they were, bombarding the venue with messages about how it was going to be a hate rally and blah, 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 all of that. And so I believe in this country, we were the very first event that had to go underground and seek a different venue because that first venue pulled out on us. So that was really my kind of when I really experienced it firsthand.
Baptism of fire.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
I mean, your background is in literature and language, isn't it? And so I wonder how that impacts on your interest in this particular movement and your interest in what to be a woman is.
Language is critically important because, obviously it's the way that we communicate with each other. And obviously language can be used in all kinds of ways. Like it can be used to clarify, or it can be used to deceive, it can be used to persuade, it can be used to obscure, it can be, language can be used in all kinds of things. And I think if language is so blatantly misused as to try and naturalize and establish the idea that women can be a certain type of woman. It's clearly such a dreadful misuse and a really harmful misuse of language that I was quite surprised with my early involvement. I'd say from around those early days, sort of 2012 through sort of 2014, 2015, 2016, as more women would get involved, that we just, those of us who believe that language was absolutely crucial and that this movement was gaining ground on the basis of its misuse of language in order to falsify reality, we just seem to be in a minority. It just seemed to me, if the whole problem is that now in law and in society and in culture that everyone is pretending that men are women, and that all the harms come from that. Well, obviously, by you referring to them as trans women and calling them she, that's perpetuating the problem. The thing is, it's a really straightforward point that the language we use reflects the reality that we perceive, and it also reflects our values. If we use the term sex work, you're saying something about your values and you're constructing this particular thing in a particular way that totally legitimizes it
Yeah,
and sort of
true.
sanitizes it. So I think, it, so that's what I mean. It's such a straightforward point.
I think I sort of see both sides as well, though, because I think sometimes, yes, you use language to express yourself and to describe things around you, but sometimes you might also be using language to try and achieve something with other people. I remember somebody who taught university students
Mm.
saying, I've got to get in the room and I've got to keep them with me to a certain point so that I can start to present the different arguments. And so to do that and to be accepted. So do you see what I'm saying? So sometimes it's that there's, I suppose there's different situations where you might need to,
I,
um,
yeah, I do. I do see what you're saying, and that's the sort of classic argument. That's the argument I used to hear all
mm,
the time, a few years ago, like, oh, well, we need to convince people and
mm,
we need to sit down with policymakers and blah, 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 blah.
mm,
But I don't think you convince anyone by using language where there's a cognitive dissonance. And I think
mm,
if you understand that men are men and they're not women, if you start referring to them as she, you're creating a cognitive dissonance in your own mind.
mm,
And for me, anytime I've heard women use clear, precise language, it
mm,
actually gets rid of all of that cognitive dissonance
mm,
and it gets rid of all that pretense.
mm,
And I don't think that we would convince anyone of, not that anyone should need to be convinced because it's so bloody obvious, but I don't think we'd convince anyone of, say, the harms and inherent violence of prostitution by repeatedly calling it sex work. What you're
no,
doing is validating it. So I think just have the courage to speak on your own terms. And
that's
again,
important.
I think that is happening more and more. That, I just think anytime any presenter on the media introduces a debate
Mm,
as, oh, like now with the, Trump's executive order, it's immediately introduced as, oh, his attack on
mm,
trans rights or whatever.
mm, mm,
And I just think anytime that a piece like that gets introduced as a debate about trans rights, I just think we always have to take it back and say, no,
yeah,
this is a debate about the importance of women only space and
yeah,
women's
yeah,
rights. That's what it's about.
yeah,
And it's
yeah,
about defending us from the assault on those.
yeah,
Anyway,
yeah. It's wearing, isn't it?
yeah, it is. They're the same thing. So I don't really say too much about it now. It's just the sheer endless repetition of it. Oh, God. Yeah.
So I know Bex is going to ask you a bit more about pornography, but before she gets into the weeds of it, I suppose,
Yeah.
I mean, you've written about pornography and how it's reported on in academia. From your sort of viewpoint and over the years, what impact do you think it's having generally on society? I suppose particularly with the internet.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think the impact is really evident now, isn't it? And it's something that I haven't really had so much time these past years to be devoting to, the whole question of what happens when the glorification of men's very serious sexual violence against women gets when that gets totally normalized as part of the culture, and men are accessing and masturbating to this stuff in unimaginable numbers, in the millions and millions, and it just gets endlessly defended. So I haven't, I suppose, because of the work that I've been doing has been either on, is certainly all, part of the same thing, has been on femicide, and now sort of working on high risk domestic violence. God, again, talking about language, it's all really this language I find so euphemistic. High risk, it's all male violence against women. But anyway,
Yeah, yeah.
um, but when I was more vocal specifically about about pornography, when that was the sort of the main thing I was focusing on, um, I was working more because I was doing my PhD at the time, and then working in academia and going to all these usually pretty terrible conferences and seminars and things. Um, there were a few of us, myself, obviously Gail Dines, Sheila Jeffries, and some of the activists as well that I was friends with at the time. We were really swimming against the tide in terms of arguing about the devastating impact that it's having on on young women in particular, young men, like children, like women generally in the culture. And you had all these really at the time, like quite high profile, very established academics, professors, academics who are much more established and in secure employment and very well remunerated for their work, making absolutely ridiculous arguments that about porn as being in the realm of fantasy, and that it was something that everyone was entitled to, and
there was
wasn't.
an argument about it being liberating for women, wasn't there, at
Oh
some
yeah,
point
that's
in
I
the
mean that's still
90s?
going on, all of
Yeah.
that empowerment and things. But like one of the main ideas was that it didn't have any real effect in the culture. That it was just in this other realm of fantasy, and that all the women who were involved in who were basically being serially raped in the production of porn, they were, it was empowering for them. They wanted to do it. It was their choice. And for the rest of us, we just it was in this realm of leisure or fantasy, and it didn't have any impact in the real world, which is, I mean, that's just wrong on any which way you want to cut it. It's just ludicrous, because if the kind of images that we see on screen or around us have no impact, well, how do you explain the existence of the advertising industry? Like, how do you explain that if images have no effect? But also, obviously, the production of pornography exists in the real world. It's not in some abstract fantasy realm. As soon as you're videoing, you've got real people, you're producing something, it is in the real world anyway. So but that was the kind of argument that was very strong at the time, and probably still still going around now.
That's been really fascinating to listen to. So, you started talking to Jane there about pornography and particularly the impact the internet's had. And how it seems to me is that within living memory, within the last few generations, porn has gone from something you would have to actively seek out to something you would have to very purposefully go to great lengths to avoid. What impact do you think that's having on the children that are growing up in this situation?
Yeah, I think Bex, can I just say, I think the way that you've summarized it there is absolutely perfect. I think that's you've just encapsulated it perfectly. That's exactly it. It was especially when we think of the nature of pornography, and the way that that's changed as well over the last, what would we say, like couple of decades at the very least. The what once would have been seen as niche or extreme, or all the extreme, I'm not saying any of it is good, but in terms of the really horrifyingly, quite unimaginably violent and misogynist and degrading content, and everything that gets kind of categorized under the sort of this term extreme. Once upon a time, if not that long ago, a matter of a few decades back, if a man wanted to access that, well, he would probably have been risking quite a lot. First of all, he'd have to try and just find where he could seek it out. It would be all the kind of in the brown paper bag under the counter, all of that kind of thing. And at any point, if he was sort of discovered in that process by law enforcement or whoever, he really would have could potentially have been in quite some trouble. So there was there were various sort of checks and balances that would have meant that it was a relatively minority thing. Whereas now, as you say, you actually have to actively try to avoid it. And in fact, for most of us, it's quite unavoidable because everything has shifted, hasn't it? So where some of this really hideous violent content has become so mainstream. Well, what has happened in terms of the mainstream culture, in terms of just what we're surrounded by, if we go onto the tube or like the billboards that we're surrounded by, or even just watching a, average TV chat show or something like that, or the coverage of different films, the pornification of women's bodies is just completely unavoidable, isn't it? It's just the references to BDSM in fashion and the references to, violent, sexual violence in music and things like that. It's just unavoidable. So I think that's a really, really very long way of saying what you said in a really concise way that I think you've absolutely hit it on the head. And obviously I think it's had a huge and devastating impact. I mean, when I was talking about all this more, it was probably the last 10 years or so, I was certainly finding plenty of examples of cases that were reported in the media of young male perpetrators of sexual violence, boys, sometimes even, pre-teens or certainly early teens, committing terrible acts of sexual violence either on girls in their schools or even within their family, and that having been done, that they wanted to act out some of these terrible things that they'd seen online and online pornography. And there was also quite a number of cases, absolutely horrific, tragic cases of young men becoming porn producers that through raping or committing sexual assault on very young teenage girls and filming it, and then that being shared around. And then a number of cases where those poor young women who'd been subjected to that terrible violation then actually ended their own lives as a result of that. So anyway, those are some sort of specific examples. But obviously, we look at what has just become normalized in the culture, and we can see the influence of porn. Particularly this. I mean, I keep using the term horrific, but it's all horrific. The idea that uh, choking a woman as part of some kind of, sexual relationship or sexual encounter, the idea that that is in any way desirable or acceptable, the fact that that is even thinkable, owes a lot to pornography and the way that it has become both so easily accessible, so ubiquitous, and the nature of its content has become so extremely violent and misogynistic. So I don't know what do you think about that, Bex?
Yeah, definitely. I think what I see is that pornography has normalized sexual trends, and it seems that part of that is this sort of race to the bottom to see how harmful and derogatory these trends can be towards women. And 10 years ago, that was a fascination with anal or surprising a female partner with anal. And now we've seen choking and we've seen a rise in deaths related to strangulation and choking in the bedroom. But it's not just straight relationships it's affecting. Obviously, we've spoken before to Alison Ellis, and she mentioned how when she searched the word lesbian, the first thing that comes up is nothing to do with actual lesbians, it's the porn category. What impact is this having on women and girls?
Yeah, I mean that's another like really sort of hideous reversal of the times, isn't it? That the word lesbian has become outlawed. Like so many young lesbians now don't use the term lesbian about themselves, but it's been used by either by straight men in terms of the pornography that they want to access. It's usually like one of the top three search terms, isn't it? Or by men who pretend to be lesbians. So yeah, so that's a very nice sort of Daley-esque reversal of the truth. And yeah, again, gosh, I think you've got a gift for hitting the nail on the head, and like that's exactly it in terms of the race to the bottom, because I remember in my book as well charting some of this, what was becoming mainstreamed. And there's like all of these degrading acts, like the ejaculating on a woman's face or different parts of her body, like all of that's just become so normalized. And then I think one of the frightening things is that once these things become normalized, that is that for a start you get this argument that men, or they probably include women now, I don't think there's too many women who want to see that, but that men have this, there's some inalienable right to view it. But you kind of think, well, until quite recently, most men seem to get by without having, like, without being able to view all this stuff. So it's just so funny how these things get embedded so quickly and then get established as some kind of right. But they really shift the whole meaning of what sex is or what sex might be. And I'd be interested to speak to more young women about their experiences now. I just can't imagine to be in that environment. It makes me feel very, very protective, and I just want to say, just get away from there. I have spoken with women, I guess they're probably in their 30s now, who have talked about their sort of experiences of dating men or relationships with men, where they feel they've had to kind of educate men, that men have basically learned what they think that this version of sex is from pornography. And then I can think of one particular conversation I've had where the woman said, well, I've had to educate my partner that that's not what I want, that's not pleasurable for me. But really, I just think, do we want to be that intimate and that have something that I mean, the word love just seems to be totally forgotten and out of the equation. I would not want to have any kind of sexual intimacy with anyone that I didn't feel it was an expression of some kind of loving connection. I just would have no interest in that. And I'm not saying that necessarily has to mean like a really long-term, everlasting commitment to someone, but I just think it's a form of communication, a form of loving communication. And that just seems to be completely out of the picture. So you've got this ever expanding pornoscape with, like you say, all these hideous misogynist things that sort of race to the bottom of like what worse can we do to this woman? And by its very nature, it kind of excludes and eliminates anything that isn't like that. So I just think women really have to just get away from it altogether. And I remember actually years and years ago going to this really good lecture about video games. And again, like that's something I really don't know much about. I've got absolutely zero interest in them. But like all these horrible things like Grand Theft Auto and Call of Duty, that really glorify violence. Within these scenarios, like of the games, no one ever hugs anyone else. And it's such a simple observation. Like the only thing that's permissible is this kind of competitive, violent, aggressive masculinity where you have to be conquer, like I don't know, you have to be victorious over other men or conquer territory or conquer women or whatever it is you do. And I think it's this similar kind of thing in pornography. By its very nature, it's going to eliminate anything that isn't about male domination and female subordination. And then, so it's unsurprising really that is what we're seeing. And I just think, like women, academics like Gail Dines, who are really sounding the alarm about this and saying like, this is a social experiment. It's an unprecedented social experiment of like bringing young boys up in this culture with access to all of this stuff, and the way that it's just has become so very much part of their world. Like she said, no, we're doing this social experiment with no thought for the consequences of it. And I just think, yes, she was absolutely right. Absolutely. And now we are living with the consequences of it.
I mean, it's interesting you talk about male entitlement there and how, as one thing becomes normalized, they look for the next. How has OnlyFans affected this? Because it seems to me that girls now are being encouraged to become our own producer of pornography. And you do unfortunately see women recruiting girls, and I've seen, on social media saying count down until you're 18 so you can start your OnlyFans and flashing the lifestyle that they can have, material goods. What effect is this having on girls? And how can we counter it?
It's I mean, what can I say that um it's like it's just really devastating and really terrible. I mean, I just feel like there's not really much else to say about it. I have seen a couple of articles that have taken issue with claims of OnlyFans to be feminist and empowering, but I just feel that that claim is so ludicrous. I wouldn't even waste my breath arguing against it because it's so ridiculous. It's like saying, oh, lopping off your limbs is a really empowering thing for athletes to do or something. Like it's just it's so absurd. And I do think we are living in times of such complete reversal and absurdity. And I noticed that I think one of the things it's doing is putting everyone totally on the back foot. So we seem to be spending a lot of time just stating the really bloody obvious over and over again, like feminism is for women. Well, yes. Reality matters for feminism. Well, yes. It's not empowering to have 100 men rape you. No. I just think a lot of this, in terms of what we can do about it, is men will always dream up more and more awful ways to violate and subjugate women. And I don't think we're in a very powerful position if we're constantly on the back foot saying how bad it is and endlessly analyzing it. And I know I've done a lot of that myself. I've done a lot of analyzing and saying, and I've spent most of this conversation talking about how bad it all is. But I just think in the long run we're all dead and we could spend our whole lives saying how bad it is, and then there's something even worse next week, and then we'll spend next week saying how bad it all is as well. So I think what I would really like to see, and I'd be interested in hearing other women's opinion of this, I feel there is something to be said for turning, Sonia Johnson said, like taking our eyes off the guys and turning our attention onto ourselves and focusing on what do we want. I think the more that we have, that as women, as young women, whatever age we are, the more that we have a really strong sense of ourself, a strong sense of our boundaries, a strong sense of like what we want to do in the world, what we actually enjoy doing for ourselves, not as some sort of receptacle for a penis, but what we actually want to do, what we want to do creatively, what we, I don't know, what we want to achieve or how we want to spend our time. I think the more that we do that and the more we have a sense of ourselves, our boundaries get stronger and we get far more resistant and far more alert to when a man is trying to violate them. To me, that's something that I don't really see spoken about that much. I don't know if that even, I don't know how much sense that makes to you, but I like, we are surrounded by this stuff. We'd all wish that it wasn't here. And obviously, I think it's completely valid and legitimate to be doing what we can to try and change that, to try and change that broader context. But also, I think part of how we change it is by developing a stronger sense of ourselves. I think that is, things like Virago, things like having women only space, lesbian only space, supporting each other. I think for a lot of the young women, they're really surrounded by as much by pornography as by this idea that having relationships with men is inevitable and desirable, and that you just have to try and negotiate these things. Whereas actually, I don't think they are at all inevitable. I think they're very often not desirable, and there are other ways of being, one of which is being lesbian, but not necessarily that. But I just would like to have far more focus on ourselves and strengthening our sense of self. Like Mary Daly always spoke about self with a capital S. I think rather than endlessly be on the back foot responding to all these terrible things that men are doing. But I don't know what does that any of that resonate with you? Or
Yeah, absolutely. That really resonates. And I love what you say about relationships with men not being necessary or even desirable. It does make me think of one of my favorite quotes, which did the rounds on social media a few years ago. And unfortunately, I'm not sure who said it, but it was when we raise our daughters on a diet of Disney and Prince Charming, and our sons on a diet of porn, it's like raising lambs for the slaughter.
yeah, once again, well, good on you for remembering because once again, I think I'm going to go away from this conversation just with these really perfect, concise statements that you've given me that just encapsulate things so perfectly. But that's yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you would have ever read Woman Hating, Andrea Dworkin's first book, but if have you read it?
Yeah.
Or oh, have you? Yeah, because obviously that's so much what she's talking about, isn't she? With all the kind of the myths and legends and fairy tales,
Mm.
and all the the whole regimes of beauty practices and all of that. That are very much kind of yeah, exactly the sort of the other side of the coin. This is the kind of conversation that just makes me feel very excited about the potential to get away from just endlessly being in response and in reactions to male violence. But what strikes me is how taboo it is. In when I recently said online, like in terms of living with men and having relationships with men, that that other options are available. Oh my goodness me, like there was such a backlash against that, and I felt a really willful misconstruing of the context in which I'd said it and like what I meant by that. But I feel that it's like if we don't expand our consciousness in our minds to think about other possibilities. It's like we're trying to, like we're constantly putting blinkers on ourselves. So, yeah, I feel like, these kinds of conversations and these kind of really radical ways in which women change their lives were really part of the women's liberation movement. And for some reason, I don't know, it sort of seems to be much more conservative times we're in. And I mean that not necessarily in terms of like capital C, but socially conservative, there seems to be a real unwillingness to look reality in the face in terms of the very real problems of heterosexuality and the other ways of being, ways of living.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting seeing the response to that quote, especially on some of the sort of maybe younger skewed social media platforms where the reception was very different. Because I think amongst younger feminists, there has been a real swing back towards things like the 4B movement, separatism, womanism, and radical feminism. It's interesting because it seems like we're currently in a bit of a crossroads where within our generation there are still feminists who are saying no kink shaming, sex work is work, this is empowering, things like that. And at the same time, on the other hand, you have the 4B movement and an uprising in, radical feminist values again. It does seem that between the millennial and Gen Z, we're caught in some sort of feminist crosstide as completely opposing values are clashing across social media, the internet, and feminist spaces. What are your predictions for how this is all going to play out?
Yeah, that's really interesting because yeah, of course there is that whole, I had a really good chat with an American woman who was part of, do they call it West 4B? Gosh, yeah, that I really, really enjoyed talking to her. So obviously there has been this whole 4B movement. So there is that. And I think your kind of image of the crosstide, I think that probably is although I think there are lots of cross ties going in all different directions. I am really really pleased that that's happening, and really it seems something that is possibly a very kind of fruitful direction for women and for young women in particular who are particularly affected by all the kind of things that we were just talking about. So I guess I don't know that I've really got any predictions, but I guess it it will be what we make it. So if enough of us are out there and visible and willing to have these conversations, then I guess it's going to go in a certain direction. But yeah, unfortunately, all these like again, just ridiculous things like this notion of kink shaming. It's just so absurd, isn't it? Like, I think that's kind of that language again is quite an interesting example of normalization. Because years ago, it it was referred to even kind of before my time really. It was referred to as sadomasochism, and I don't know, maybe a lot of people didn't know then that those words came from that the Marquis de Sade, and I don't even know how you say it, whatever his name is, something von Massock, the other hideous misogynist. And then it kind of becomes BDSM, and then that acronym kind of loses that connection with, well, in the case of the Marquis de Sade, murderously, uh, hideously violent and misogynist individual, and the other one as well. Um, and then it kind of becomes kink, and so you just lose the connections with actually understanding that it is a hatred of women that's at the heart of it. So, and then if you raise an objection to it, like you're seen as being anti-woman or something because you're shaming it. Like it's so convoluted, isn't it? The way that the language has gone. So I think that, yeah, that is all gonna maybe take a bit of a while to unpick all that. But then again, sometimes things just happen very, very quickly. Things kind of leap ahead, or in ways that you can't always predict. But I'm sure you've been struck as well by talking about OnlyFans, like just the juxtaposition of the again unspeakable sexual violence that Dominique Pellico and all his associates subjected his wife and apparently his daughter to as well. All of that, everything we know about the grooming and rape and torture gangs, that all the things that are coming out now, as the horrors of that are emerging. At the same time, you could just as easily be seeing items about these women trying to outdo each other on OnlyFans to basically have the same things done to them.
The common denominator in all of those was the queues of men. So the queues of men outside the court, the perpetrators going in, the queues of the men outside the room in the OnlyFans thing.
Yeah,
all horrible.
absolutely. I guess one of the main things is that we need to have a movement again that names it very clearly and that completely rejects it. And I think alongside that is um, creating the kind of women-only spaces and communities where we have just such a much stronger sense of ourselves that we are far that we just won't entertain that kind of thing, and that then we are visible in the world. That's but yeah, we're starting from not a very good place, because actually what I do see as I go out in the world is so many young women in particular having all the horrible invasive beauty practices, all the fillers, the injection, all of this horrible stuff done to them. And I just see basically this kind of like, living, walking pornography around us that uh, we're just kind of witnessing the acting out of male violence, in this very everyday kind of way. But I think, we have to start somewhere, and I think I've really enjoyed having this conversation, and I'm really pleased, Bex, that you're so you're clearly so conscious of it, and that you're create this podcast and do something about it. So I'd definitely love to speak more and maybe think more with both of you about it in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
We might invite her back, might we, Bex?
What, me? Me or
We-
Julia?
We might.
I always like to plant myself a little invite there
Oh,
too.
yeah, definitely. Oh,
definitely.
it's been amazing.
So we tend to finish episodes asking the same two questions. And the first one is, for people who are interested in this topic, where can they look to start learning more?
If anyone wants to read my book, I'd be very pleased. I think, in particular, if anyone is listening who's kind of feels a bit befuddled by all of these arguments that are made about pornography, that claiming that it's empowering. The second chapter of my book, I think that was the one that I was most pleased with, because I look at those arguments and I basically take them apart. I look at the feminist or the radical feminist critique of pornography, and I look at like all of those arguments that I was encountering the whole time about empowerment, or it's just fantasy, it's not real, or it's work or whatever, those kinds of things. So if I say so myself, I think that's quite a good introduction. I think Gail Dine's work is obviously really good as well. I think, both of our books are sort of, came out quite a while ago now. I know there's a book that's due out. Jo Bartosh, and I know she's just finished submitted her manuscript, so her book will be coming out, and I'm really hoping that will help to galvanise things.
Yeah.
And if anyone listens to the WDI, Women's Declaration International, they have Radical Feminist Perspectives. They've done a few on pornography. So that's quite a good place. But I'm sure there are things that I've forgotten.
Oh,
but
that's great. Some really good suggestions there for people sort of starting into it.
Yeah, definitely Gail Dines. I mean, Andrea Dworkin's book on pornography, Sheila Jeffrey's book, The Industrial Vagina. There was a book by Spinifex, Big Porn Inc.
Yeah, some really great suggestions there. And so we come to our final question, which we ask every week. Do you have a woman of the moment, or someone who inspires you, or whose voice you'd like to highlight?
I do actually, Bex, and I think it's actually you.
Yes.
So no false modesty.
Oh gosh.
Because I only met you so briefly before, and you didn't really have that much chance to chat. But just everything you said, I just feel I've only really started to get to know you, and I am just absolutely thrilled to meet someone who has got, I just think, such a clear understanding of the situation we find ourselves in, and is just so brilliantly articulate expressing that. So I hope you're not going to be falsely modest and cut that out. But I'm happy to announce that it's actually you.
I'm so flattered. You've brought a tear to my eye.
Oh, bless you.
Well, a big thanks to Julia for talking to us today. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please do like, share, subscribe, all of that good stuff to help us spread the word. From this week's Woman of the Moment, thank you very much, and we hope to see you next time.